Ross, thanks very much. Can I just acknowledge you and Karen and John as the principal sponsors. Obviously, Ali, just want to thank you and Johnny Weiss at Trans-Tasman Business Circle for putting on today's lunch and the various other events I've had the opportunity to speak at. They must have the Rolodex from heaven to get this many people along for lunch. It's a bit of a traditional thing, actually, that the Minister of Finance always hosts a bit of a soiree in his office after the budget. So it's been going on for a long period of time, and they get up and they invite the Treasury over, and a bunch of other people have been involved, and it's a bit of a roast really about sort of what's gone on. And anyway, previously I've kind of been on TV that's been based in Auckland, so I haven't actually made it. But last night, because I did Canberra Live from the Legislative Chamber, I was in Wellington, so I wandered along, although Bill did seem to point out that made me a good news Prime Minister because I only turned up when we were in surplus, but that was okay. But he was lamenting the fact to a certain degree that budgets are these things these days where there's that much sort of pre-warning for what's going on, that many announcements. They're never going to hold the media's attention forever. And apparently by then, which was about sort of 8 o'clock at night, we'd been kicked off as the lead story on one of the newspaper websites by a sort of cat attacks dog, which looking after a young person. So he seemed really disappointed by that there's some other news story had kicked the budget off. I was actually quite relieved because I thought it could be yet another story about Steffi Key taking off another item of clothing. So any kind of story that's not there is good news from my perspective. I'm sorry you had to navigate our friends outside, but it is slightly instructive that they did organise the protest before we actually read the budget. So that might be an indication of maybe they should go away and have a bit of a look at it first before they consider what they're protesting about. But the bottom line of yesterday's budget, I think, is a fruition of sort of 5.5 years of hard work by I think the government, but businesses and New Zealanders right across the country, and an acceptance actually that we had to both change and contend with some very significant issues, whether they were the recession we inherited when we came in 2008, the global financial crisis, or the Christchurch earthquakes. And it's kind of easy to forget about some of those things. Ross won't forget about because of QBE, and there'll be other insurers in the room. But just to give you a sense of how big a deal that is, the budgets have allocated $15.6 billion to the rebuild of Christchurch. That is a massive event. There's roughly 200,000 homes in Christchurch, and 91% of them were damaged in the earthquake. I think the EQC alone has had 750,000 individual claims, more than any other insurance company, I think, in any other natural disaster around the world. We've demolished 1,200 buildings in the CBD alone. So it is a major event. And that's sort of what the country's had to contend with on top of the global financial crisis and everything else. So I think if the real story for me behind the budget actually is just the strength of those macroeconomic numbers. Yep, we're back in surplus. I was talking to John Armstrong, the Herald's political commentator, yesterday afternoon, and he said a surplus is a bit like Luke Skywalker's, moonbeam or whatever he has. That's our cat, actually. I'm sure he doesn't have our cat. If he does, you'd better give it back because Brian will get very upset. But lightsaber is the expression I was looking for. He said it's a bit like the lightsaber. It's of enormous significance, even if it's not that big, because it's a sign to New Zealanders that the country is coming right, that we are getting through the worst of what we've seen, that the books are getting back in order. I think it also reflects where we should be, because we are a small country at the bottom of the world. No one owes us a living, and actually if the chips are down, no one's necessarily going to lend to us. So actually having our books in order and having debt at acceptable levels for a small country at the bottom of the world is a very important issue. If you don't get that, in the end it's called Greece. Okay? That is the bottom line. In the end, if you owe enough, other people make a decision about the choices that will be undertaken in your economy. And so getting back to surplus has been very important. One of the things when we came in, to give you a sense of the enormity of the task, and I probably talked about it at lunch last year, but When we came in 08, the Treasury essentially said to us, look, your numbers are awful, carry on spending the way you are, inheriting the programs that you are, debt to GDP will be 60% of GDP by 2020, so 150 billion in nominal terms. I think the budget showed it was around about 26%, but it's on its way to under 20% by 2020. So that is a massive difference in debt. It's about $90 billion less debt this country will have by 2020 than it would have had if we hadn't changed course. And that's a really important thing for future generations of New Zealanders and for the confidence of the country. But what it also raised was an interesting question that Bill and I started tossing around a couple of months ago, which was, okay, if we're going to be under 20% of GDP, and we fundamentally had quite small allowances of new expenditure. So for the first 4 budgets, it was 0. Last year's was $1 billion. This one was about 900 million. How much could we spend to actually keep debt under 20% of GDP and not basically challenge that factor or put too much pressure on interest rates? So we had a conversation not just with the Treasury but the Reserve Bank about those two factors, because the government's stated aim is to keep debt between 10 and 20% of GDP. And the answer is roughly $1.5 billion. So one of the debates that's going to come up in the course of, I guess, the next 3 or 4 months is really, how do you want to spend that $1.5 billion? And there are fundamentally 2 alternatives. One is we just increase the level of government expenditure up from the 900 million we had in yesterday's budget, and there'll be plenty of takers for that, plenty of departments and people that will want us to spend more money. And the second part of that is maybe there's the capacity for some sort of modest tax package within all of that. And maybe the answer is there's also something in between. I don't know. If you know anything about tax planning, what I'll tell you is they sound like big numbers when you're talking about $1.5 billion, which is sort of the extra over 3 years. It's not a lot, but it is something that you can do. And it comes to an interesting point, really, about middle New Zealand in a way, because this is the interesting thing. One of the debates that's come out of the budget that the opposition will want to run is income inequality. So fair enough, you're in opposition, you've got to argue something, and that's the case that the left have been taken. But the question is it real? Like, is that actually the case that we as a country are becoming more unequal? Because my argument to you would be it's not. If you go and have a look at the most definitive source of income inequality, it's a longitudinal study run by a guy called Brian Perry. So Brian Perry works for the Ministry of Social Development. He's been doing this work for a long time over successive governments, and he includes absolutely everything in that measure. So he looks at all income redistribution, all the things that the government does or doesn't do, all sources of income. And what his study shows is over the last decade, New Zealand has not become any more unequal. In fact, maybe at the margins slightly less, but certainly hasn't become any more unequal. In fact, it hasn't actually become any more unequal in the last 15 years. There was quite a big change between 1984 and 1990. For a variety of reasons we can go on, but that's when the blowout actually happened, as it did sort of in various places around the world. The other interesting thing it shows you is that it not only has it not become more unequal, but actually New Zealand relative to its OECD peers, so relative to Australia, the UK, the US, Canada, is less unequal, which probably comes as not a great surprise to people if you understand the United States and those countries. So that takes you to the next point, which is the argument that well-off people should be paying more. So that's the argument you'll get on the campaign trail. That's the argument that David Cunliffe was running yesterday and Russell Norman was paying yesterday. Here's an interesting thing. Pick up the budget and you'll see there's a fact sheet in the budget. It talks to you about what those numbers look like. So 2% of New Zealand taxpayers pay 22% of all personal tax. Right? So about 30% pay 80% of all personal tax, but it pieces off pretty quickly. But if you look on a household basis, 12% of New Zealand households pay 76% of all the net tax in this country, even before you start including the payments they make for New Zealand super. So the question I think you've got to have is, if that 12% isn't paying enough, at paying over 3/4 of the entire taxes paid in this country, how much is enough? Because it's a pretty fair question. At what point do they say, is this entirely fair? So take a really simple example of that. If you work for 40 hours a week, you earn the minimum wage of $14.25 an hour, and you have 3 children, and let's argue for a moment you're on your own, you earn about 30 grand, you pay about 5 grand in tax. Under the government's redistribution schemes, working for families, accommodation supplements, you will roughly get the same amount again in the hand. Not a long way away from $50,000 will be your take-home pay. If you live on the North Shore of Auckland, you earn $100,000 a year in your job, you have 3 children, and again, you're the sole income earner in that household, you'll get probably nothing for working for families, or very, very little, and you'll get no accommodation supplement, and you'll pay about $25,000, $28,000 in tax. So one person earning 30 grand, his take-home pay is about 50, and one person earning 100, their take-home pay is about 70. So you can see the squeeze on middle New Zealand, and when you think the average household or the average income in New Zealand is 54,000, one of the big drivers we're trying to do is get that average income up. So the Treasury modelling shows we think within about 3 years we can get that up to $62,000 a year. They're the aim we're going at. So I guess the point I'm making to you is just within this budget and within the last 6 years, we have been very focused on less well-off New Zealanders. So in the worst of the times when everything was going to custard, we borrowed to pay for working for families, accommodation supplements, benefits, all of those things. You know, and that's a substantial bill. So if you just look at welfare support alone, we pay $1 million an hour for the benefits in New Zealand. $1 million an hour. So it's not like the government doesn't step up and pay for those things. I think that's been an important part of it. Part of the extension and the focus in this budget obviously was with families. And again, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, of course, people will say it's good politics to ensure that every child under the age of 13 can go to the doctor for free and have their prescription for free. And there are 400,000 children in that group, and of course that's right. But it's also actually really good policy to do that as well, because what we know is that when parents take their child to the doctor and they're not fearful of having to pay the bill, then actually that has long-term implications for health. And in fact, when that policy was introduced for under 6-year-olds, it had a 14% reduction in the long-term impact of hospitalisation for youngsters. So it's not just good politics, it's actually good policy for New Zealand. And so that's really where we've been going. If you think about things like paid parental leave, many of you in the room will know that it's pretty simple just to get up and say we're going to take the leave from 14 weeks to 26 weeks. Actually, there's nothing very, very thoughtful about that, because paid parental leave in its current form is very inflexible. If you have somebody that takes paid parental leave and you want to have them to come back and they want to come back for a day's training because they're going to have a new job or an extension of their activities or whatever it might be when they're on paid parental leave, they can't do that under the current system. All sorts of people excluded. In fact, 60% of people who have, of the 100% that have a baby and take some time off in the early times, only 40% of them get paid parental leave. The other 60% are not eligible for a variety of reasons. So again, the extensions sort of come in that sort of area. So that's one thing I'd say to you. The second thing that's probably worth a bit of a discussion is housing. So the first thing I'd say to you about housing is a perennial issue. It's not new. It's been around forever. I have what's called the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, DPMC, and Helen Clark had DPMC working for 5 years, virtually the entire office, on housing. And the reason for that was housing went up a huge amount under Labor. So under that 9 years between 99 and 08, housing went up 96%. Under us, on average, it's up 28%. So the question is not will houses go up, because in a growing economy where you've got all sorts of factors happening from migration and others, yes, your house prices will probably rise. And in fact, actually, the bankers in the room will tell you that's not a bad thing. It's the rate of increase, actually, that takes place. It's not that houses are moving slightly upwards. It's when they're rapidly going up that is the problem. So it's a really easy issue to identify, and it's quite a challenging issue to resolve. But there are only two ways you can fix the housing issues overall. One is on the supply side, and one is through thrashing the demand side. And the demand side issues are raise interest rates. So by the time we came into office and Labor had been there with an overheated housing market, you were paying 10.9% for your mortgage. Today it's about 6%. Okay, because the bank just choked things up. So the point here is, will fixing the supply work? The answer is absolutely. So along with Len, who acknowledges here today, the government and the council have been working hugely constructively on how do we make sure that we consent more properties, get more homes built. We've agreed that there'll be 39,000 properties consented over the next 3 years. In fact, 33,000 sections. We're doing additional stuff. That will have quite a big impact on the supply side of Auckland. When people tell you it's all a migration issue, by the way, there's no question that migration has a small impact on housing, but I will say this, the interesting thing with migration in New Zealand at the moment is driven not by the reasons that a lot of people think. There is not a lot more people coming to New Zealand, there's a hell of a lot less people leaving New Zealand. People are voting with their feet, that is to keep their feet under their desk in their job in New Zealand, not in a job in Australia. So we used to have about 3,000 people a month go to Australia under the previous government. In March of this year, it was 350, the lowest since records began in 1986. And the people who advise us on this are telling me it's going to go positive. So we're either going to have zero or potentially more people coming from Australia than going to Australia. So the point there is it's not changing in terms of who's coming in. And in fact, as Michael Barnett pointed out on TV the other day, you actually need those people coming in, both to help the rebuild in terms of the skills that they might have in the building of homes, but also why would we want to stop the fast-growing ICT business that's operating here, or the fast-growing business in any sector of our economy, from hiring someone with the skills that they might not be able to get in New Zealand and assist the overall growth of New Zealand, simply because more New Zealanders are staying here. So we need to build more homes, and part of what we've done is speed up that process with the RMA. Yesterday you can see that we eliminated temporarily at least some of those duties, so that should add about or reduce the cost of building a home by about 3,500. I hear the arguments all the time about capital gains tax, stop foreigners buying it, all of those things. If you want living proof of why that doesn't work, look across the Tasman. It's called Australia, but like the Labor Greens experiment, I didn't think worked terribly well either. It's called Australia. Go and have a look at what they do. They have restrictions on foreigners buying a home other than new homes. They have a more extensive capital gains tax than we have. They have all sorts of things, stamp duties, you name it, they have the lot. They sell more homes to foreigners, they're more unaffordable than us, and their house prices have been rising faster. That stuff does not work. And the reason it doesn't work is because capital gains is a realisation tax which excludes about 75%, if not more, of all houses. So people buy a beach house and they don't sell it, it has no impact at all. And in so much it would have any impact at all on a house that someone's renting, it will only be to lift rents. So I think, if you look at Auckland, as the primary issue here around housing and Christchurch with the rebuild, if we want to fix those issues, we need to keep doing what we're doing. Consent more homes, make sure we've got the people, make sure that process is as fast as we can, keep reforming in all those areas. But it's build more properties, fundamentally build up and build out. And part of that is building the infrastructure that supports that. A couple of other things I think that are worthy of a discussion. I think overall, if you look at New Zealand and what we've been trying to do and where we're trying to go, I think we have had a good relationship with the business community. Why? Because businesses create jobs. In the end, the government really doesn't create jobs. The government creates the environment that encourages capital to be invested and for people to create jobs. And the one thing I think the business community, outside of everything else, wants is certainty of what we're doing. And over the last 6 years, what we've tried to be is eminently predictable. If we start changing on you and start doing lots of things and start doing things that we said we wouldn't do, that will confuse the hell out of everybody. But what I do know is you need flexible labour markets, very good infrastructure, a high level of skills of what's taking place. You need a capital markets that works. You need international connectivity with our businesses, and you need the government trying to alter the things that it can alter, like labour laws or like planning laws, all of those things, and staying out of the things that it actually can't control. The second thing I'd say to you is that I think if you look at, because it's an interesting position with Australia at the moment, isn't it, in terms of where they're going and what they're doing. And I could have an endless debate that could probably get me in massive trouble if I went too far into it about whether they're doing the right thing or the wrong thing. But the interesting thing is, are we likely to face a massive crisis over the next 5 or 10 years, let's say the next 5 years because things get a bit tricky, in the international economy? My view of that is no. If you'd asked me that question in 2008 when we came in, the answer was absolutely yes. But actually, you look around the world, the United States, I'm telling you now, is back big time. So the United States, those corporate balance sheets are in fantastic shape. Yep, they might be still a bit slow in terms of job creation, but the United States is back. We said, as Minister of Tourism, our numbers from the United States are very strong. It's actually equally true in Australia. The question about Australia might be that they have some economic issues, but in so much they have a crisis, it could become a crisis of confidence, not actually a crisis of their economy. Because if it is, it's showing up in a very funny way, because as Minister of Tourism, our forward bookings for the ski season out of Australia are phenomenal, and we haven't even started our advertising program over there in any major way. Their budget documents still show they're going to grow at 2.75%. So if you look at the United States, that market is strong and getting much stronger. You look in Europe, yes, it's got long-term problems, but actually they've probably seen the bottom there. You're actually seeing better growth in a place like the United Kingdom than you might have seen, which takes you really to Asia. And the question is what's going to happen there. And a lot of what you hear is that there will be a credit crunch and China's going to fall over, and there are plenty of smart commentators who write those things in the paper. And one day they might well be right. But is it going to happen in the next few years? I reckon not a dog show. Not a dog show. You go and have a look at what's happening in China. Yes, they probably have some significant issues buried within their banking system. These are people that have $4 trillion in cash in reserves. If anybody has the capacity to clean up their banking system quietly, away from things, it is the Chinese. They have huge capacity to change the way that their currency trades, and you're already starting to see them do that. They have enormous control over the regulations of their SOE sector and the banking sector, so their capacity, again, to do things there is enormous. And what's happening in China is a massive change away from being this huge juggernaut of exports for the sake of exports to becoming a much more consumption-led economy. So interestingly enough, when we were up there not that long ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, a little bit longer ago, but 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I had lunch with Xi Jinping, or dinner with Xi Jinping, the president. The first thing I said to him is, tell me a bit about economic growth, where you're going, what does your numbers look like, all this sort of stuff, tell me about the banking issues. The interesting thing that he said was, yeah, we're going to grow at 7.5%, all those other issues I can handle. But the very next thing he said to me is, the environment is the single biggest issue we're going to face. And I said to him, really? He said, well, our consumer base is getting wealthy. Our consumer base is getting wealthy. They don't want air quality that they can't breathe. They don't want water standards that are really low. So you really look at what's happening out there, and you can see it from a New Zealand point of view. I mean, you just take China. So 5 years ago, we sold them $500 million worth of dairy products. Today it's $5 billion. If you like crayfish and you think you pay too much for it, it's because they're in China. Okay? 5 years ago, we sold $1 million worth of stuff in that area, crustaceans. Now it's $250 million. When I went up there a year ago, the first thing, about 2 or 3 of them said to me, and they're very joined up systems, so when one of them says it to you, they all mean it, was we want to buy more meat. They've gone from pretty much nowhere to the largest buyer of New Zealand sheep meat. These are big, big numbers. When these guys sit down and say, we are going to go from $20 billion worth of two-way trade, which roughly looks like us exporting $12 billion and us buying $8 billion from them in imports, to $30 billion within the next 5 years, what they really mean is they're probably going to buy $21 billion and we're going to buy an extra $1 billion to $9 billion. That is what a very, very wealthy consumer base looks like. And I always tell people the story about we were at this lunch at the Shanghai Yacht Club, which is vaguely interesting because no one there owns a yacht, so I don't know how that kind of works. But anyway, I said to this guy, "What do you do?" And he said, "I'm a property developer." And I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "What do you develop?" He said, "Residential." And I said, "Okay, what are they like?" He said, "They're apartments." And I said, "How much do they cost?" So he rattles this number off in renminbi. So I said, "It's about 600,000 New Zealand dollars." He said, "Yeah, that's right." I said, "How the hell do these people afford to buy these things?" He said, "Well, they have to have a 30% deposit, right?" But he said, "Our company's quite big and we pay okay." But he said, "We pay our middle managers 200,000 US, and I like to pay them a bonus of 200,000 US. I said, "Wow." I said, do you build lots of apartments?" He said, "Yeah, I like to build them in 10,000 unit lots." So I felt like saying, "Ring Len, you can fix our housing problems in sort of half an hour, you know?" But that's what you're dealing with, isn't it? I mean, honestly, you know, I was in the paper because I was saying this stuff at our regional conference, but, you know, I get up in Parliament and I listen to these muppets getting up saying, you know, don't have a free trade agreement, don't sell things to the world, don't have foreigners coming here, don't have foreign capital. Okay, we can be Fortress New Zealand if we want to be, but I'll tell you what, I'd back New Zealand and New Zealanders to compete on that world stage, to succeed and to win. You know, if we can get TPP done, and you know, that's a work in progress with the United States, but that is going to open us up a free trade agreement to a $16.5 trillion economy, the biggest economy in the world. Are you really saying that with a free sort of access into that market, that New Zealand is going to sell more to the United States that ends up buying from it? I just don't buy it. I'm sorry, but I just think that New Zealand is a country which can be very, very successful, and we have two big factors that are driving that. Obviously Asia, and the other thing is the internet. And that capacity for us to use technology to drive productivity and drive demand. The really big challenge for New Zealand is not that. I'm telling you now, the really big challenge for New Zealand is getting that 20% of kids who are still coming out of our schools hopelessly, inadequately trained and with the skills to compete in the modern world. Because as I say to people, you know, the days of going to the freezing works and actually working there for the rest of your life, they're over. Go to Scott Technology in Dunedin and they'll show you their equipment that automates an abattoir. They can cut your rack of lamb within 1 millimetre. Fully automated processing plants. Yep, there'll be people, just like there is right across Auckland and New Zealand when I go to those businesses. They're highly automated, they have a lot more people, but they're a lot higher skilled. And in the end, if you really want to deal with the issues for the people that are out the front, the truth of all of that is you have to get their children and every child in New Zealand with a world-class education, being able to read and write and do maths and compete in the modern world. The only way to lift them out of poverty is through work and their capacity to work, because the welfare system will never be enough to provide people a level of income that they truly need to have a lifestyle that gives them choices. And in the end, you know, my view of the country is actually we're becoming a lot more confident, both as a nation and I think as people, that we can do well on the world stage, that we have got something pretty special about New Zealand. And I just think that we shouldn't be frightened of our own shadow. We shouldn't buy into the arguments about that somehow we're going to be overrun or we can't compete. I think we should just get out there and make sure that we are going to win on that world stage, that our businesses can compete, and where the government can assist, whether it's through NZTE or whatever it's doing, we've got to make all that stuff happen. But the organic determination of New Zealanders and the opportunities on our borders are so great that if we don't take them in the next 5 years, mark my words, people will look back and say this was the biggest wasted opportunity we had. This is the industrialisation and the wealth creation of Asia, and it's a one-in-a-generation move. And we have to go out there and take that and not be afraid of that and not be afraid of the odd politician that is going to play on the fears of a small group of New Zealanders. It isn't right, it won't work, and it won't deliver the results New Zealanders want, because what in the end they want is freedom to make choices for themselves and their families, financial independence and security. And the only way through that is a successful, globally connected New Zealand. Thanks very much.